Today, I'd like to explore the extent to which new structures and functions of everyday storytelling emerge through the temporal and spatial affordances provided by mobile media, such as the smartphone. In my lecture, I'm going to focus on how actors use digital media to narrate from new positions compared to more traditional settings of mundane storytelling. On the one hand, in a metaphorical sense, with regard to the social positions that are taken up and described through the act of narration. And on the other hand, in a very literal sense, with regard to spatial and temporal positions. This is because mobile media multiply the moments of storytelling in terms of space and time. People tell stories when they are on their way to work, on the subway, on the street, when they are sitting on the couch or in a restaurant, when they are listening to a lecture, maybe when they're lying in the bed. Not to say they can tell stories anytime and anywhere by using mobile messaging. The temporally and spatially flexibilized storytelling using portable media devices is also characterized by the fact that people not only tell what already happened, in some cases, stories are told even before the narrated events have come to an end. Because mobile messaging users then keep their interlocutors up to date with the events which take place simultaneously in an offline situation. Today, I'm going to focus especially on these simultaneous, or maybe almost simultaneous, present tense narrations and their temporal structures. So, first, let me give you a brief overview of the outline of my presentation. The starting point for all these are the affordances of the smartphone as the current key medium of mediatized societies. As smartphones are portable devices, they are inherently offering the potential of permanent availability. For sure, this does not mean that people are actually permanently available, but it does mean that novel, more flexible temporal and spatial structures of digital communication are emerging in everyday routines. At the University of Bern, we are currently investigating these daily routines of digital communication and the temporal structuring of networked individuals in a new research project called Texting in Time. I will give you a brief insight into our first data to illustrate the more general context in which simultaneous mobilized storytelling is embedded. I think that such a closer look at the data will make it clear that we can theoretically address the practice of mobilized narration in various ways. Thus, on the one hand, I would like to reflect on how the practices of reporting and narrating relate to each other in smartphones' daily routines, and then introduce the concept of small stories as a solid research tool with a view to more interactionally oriented approaches to narratives. And in order to get to the bottom of the practice of simultaneous storytelling in particular, I will also refer to the temporal categories developed in literary studies. So today it's a colorful mishmash of narratological research that I'm referring to. All this in the hope of being able to convincingly present a case study towards the end of the lecture before concluding with a brief conclusion. So the temporal specificities of storytelling practices using smartphone-based messenger applications are linked to the communicative affordances of the smartphone as a mobile media device in general. In media theory, communicative affordances are understood as the spectrum of communicative possibilities that is recognized, accepted, and taken up by media users. An affordance analysis takes into account the overall arrangements of usage situations around a specific media device, which can be at different levels. So the question to be asked are, which communicative practices are made possible by a medium as a technical material object? Which forms of communication can be produced by means of the device, for example, dialogic or monologic communication that is structured asynchronously or synchronously and allows for a different number of participation roles. And of course, with a look at the materiality of communication, which semiotic resources can be used and potentially combined in multimodal text ensembles using that specific medium. Communication studies has already found answers to these questions when it comes to smartphones. So for example, Andrew Schrock mentions 4 basic communicative affordances of smartphones. Portability, that is the fact that smartphones are designed to be carried around. Availability, that is the constant potential for communication because of its portability. Multimediality, that is the convergence of different media types in one device. And here we could add multimodality, so the interweaving of different semiotic types. And locatability, that is the fact that smartphones enable GPS tracking and thus reconceptualize the perception of space for users. The temporal dimension of smartphones, which are important today with regard to narrative practices, is primarily related to two of these basic affordances, portability and availability. The portability of the device, which results from its handy size on the one hand and its online access via broadband cellular network technology on the other, enables users to always have their smartphone with them and is therefore a precondition for potential availability around the clock. However, the extent to which users make use of these communicative affordances and how they transfer them into socially shared practices is a downstream question that needs to be answered empirically. Communication studies and media anthropology show that the widespread idea of constant availability does not generally correspond to usage practices, and that practices of intentional non-use or self-retraction from constant availability, for example, by switching on the flight mode, are quite common among postmodern networked individuals. Instead, the temporal embedding of smartphone communication in people's everyday lives is more evident in the form of a rhythmization of usage episodes. This is what Carolyn Tagg and Agnieszka Lyons describe with their day in a life approach. Individuals focus on their mobile devices from time to time as part of their everyday routines. These moments of device attention then produce a certain rhythm in their interactions. Tagg and Lyons say, multiple digital conversations can be shaped not only by social demands and conventions, but by the wider rhythms of an individual's day as individuals check their phones in instances of device attention. Sometimes these moments of operating the device are the primary focus of the actors. Then it's their dominant involvement, as Goffman would call it. Sometimes it's carried out in parallel with other activities and social projects, what would be more of a subordinate involvement then. What needs to be considered in any case is that smartphone-based communication is always embedded in an offline context that interacts with possible online activities in a variety of ways. The rhythmization of mediatized everyday communication in clusters of device attention is a particular focus of our Texting in Time research project. By using authentic screen recording video data, the project examines the smartphone-based communication of about 30 participants over a period of 2 weeks each. Such a comprehensive data collection not only makes it possible to understand the processes of smartphone-based communication through the eyes of the participants, but also to reveal the rhythms that are established with various interlocutors during their everyday life. And of course, it also shows how participants are actively involved in storytelling sequences throughout their day, at least from time to time, and of course, depending on what counts for us as storytelling. I'll give you an example. This is one day of data provided by our participant, Kara. Kara is 27 years old and originally comes from northern Germany. She moved to Switzerland 6 years ago to study music at a music academy. The visualization represents Kara's messenger interactions on a 24-hour timeline on a Tuesday. Each interlocutor is shown in a separate line with a pseudonym. In addition, an app icon for each contact shows whether the communication is taking place via WhatsApp, Instagram, SMS, or iMessage. Each line also shows the time of the messages in an interactional sequence. Red dots represent the time when Kara reads an incoming message. Green dots represent the time when Kara sends an own message. The gray bars preceding red dots indicate how long a message has been waiting unread on Kara's device. By now moving along the dashed line, we follow how Kara enters into different communicative constellations throughout the day and unfolds interactions partly simultaneously in clusters of device attention. She starts the day at 9:38, first reading a message in a group chat, then switching to an Instagram message. In these first messages of the day, Kara mainly has to organize appointments related to her student life. The first message, for example, is sent by Kara's fellow student Katharina in a WhatsApp group where rehearsal room bookings are organized. Kara is a silent reader here and leaves the message unanswered. Throughout the day, the messages become more personal. For example, Kara's father gets in touch and asks when a phone call planned for today would work for her. This is followed by a short sequence to find a time slot, which now also gives us information about Kara's daily routine. Kara has free time until 12:30. After that, she stays at the academy until late afternoon, has another break, and then teaches her German student in the evening. As you can see, this daily routine is more or less reflected in her smartphone use, with Kara's different appointments resulting in episodes of non-use, as well as instances of device attention when Kara is engaged in communication with several contacts. As the dashed line gets deeper, the interactional events move closer together in time. After the break from 3 p.m., communication picks up again in the late afternoon. At 5:15, Kara plans dinner with her boyfriend Adam, while her day at the academy campus comes to an end. Kara had forgotten to buy the burger patties they needed, and she's already explaining that via text messages so that Adam could step in to buy them. After that, Kara's way home takes place between 5:30 and 6:30 then. As soon as that's video already? No, it is not. As soon as Kara arrives at her apartment, she texts her friend Katrin via iMessage and tells her about an observation she had just made on her way home. In doing so, Kara refers to a past conversation with Katrin in which Katrin told her that Katrin's brother, who lives in the same Swiss city, occasionally wears pearls in his beard. Based on this common ground, Kara now tells that she had just met a man with pearls in his beard on the street. And this guy also looked relatively similar to Katrin. So now Kara wonders whether this might have been Katrin's brother. Katrin doesn't respond immediately, but shortly after 8 p.m., she confirms Kara's suspicions. Her brother does indeed live in the street Kara just passed, and it must have been him. So Kara is excited and sends her last message of the day at 8:11 p.m. Oh, wow, how funny. Kara now has a very specific information about Katrin's brother, about his beard, and about the street where he lives, although the two never had exchanged a word with each other. Okay. Not only in these specific examples, but also in a large number of other texting sequences in Kara's data from the other recorded days, we can observe that the messages Kara exchanges with her contacts throughout the day are closely linked to her everyday activities. Many of these messages are focused on planning future activities, but many messages also contain status posting that relate to Kara's here and now, along the patterns of I am currently in place X and doing Y. It is in these moments that Kara most clearly makes use of the affordance of portability and availability. She carries the mobile phone on her body and is therefore always able to keep her digital network up to date in real time. Following Hoffman, update postings of this kind can probably be most aptly assigned to the activity type of reporting. Processes and activities are verbalized in an abstract way in relation to a certain practical relevance and fixed in their factual data without many details. For example, when a rehearsal room at the music academy becomes available, when it is time for a phone call with Kara's father, or what and when to eat for dinner, or to buy for dinner. In contrast to the communicative activity of reporting, Hoffman also describes the activity type of narrating, in which speakers linguistically refer to persons, circumstances, and facts and locate them in an initial situation that is then developed temporally and causally using narrative means up to a certain point in the narrative sequence that is set as relevant. The narrated actions are thus brought into an overarching context, creating narrative coherence. Even if many of the text messages in Kara's data set do not meet these top-down definition criteria of narratives, it is still possible to identify texting sequences in her data that appear more narrative in this sense than the mere status reports. For example, the messages about the mysterious encounter with the man with the pearls in his beard. The narrated event is located spatially and temporally on the way home, just moments ago, and then evaluated by Kara. It could have been Catherine's brother, after all. That in turn would be a somewhat interesting coincidence that would be worth telling. However, the pearly beard example is unlikely to fit in with the classic linguistic models of what constitutes a narration. If we follow the narrative grammar of Labov, narrative is typically preceded by a short abstract of what follows. After that, we typically have an orientation in which the narrated characters are located in the narrated space and time. This is followed by a linearized, temporally ordered sequence of narrated events leading up to a complication or rupture of expectation, which is then resolved and finally evaluated by the narrator before the narrative ends with the coda in which the listeners are released from the narrated world. The pearly beard example contains these narrative building blocks only rudimentarily. Although there's an orientation of characters in space and time, a linear sequence of events or linear change of state as well as a complication are not really there. Instead, the emphasis on beard pearls is in message 1, also indicated by Kara's through brackets, seems to be the narrative focus. The apparently unusual observation is evaluated by Kara, and its randomness is communicatively performed as worth telling in message 2 and 3. The narrative quality is therefore primarily created in an evaluative phase. Emojis play a role here. First, as an indication of Kara's amused attitude towards the narrative in message 3, then by Katrin, who aligns herself with this attitude in message 4. And finally, in Kara's final evaluation in message 5, where she documents her newly acquired knowledge with the change of state token, ach so, Kara also uses the interjection wow twice and explicitly describes the narrated events as funny. The narrative quality of the sequence is thus produced in collaboration between the two participants with the help of particular linguistic semiotic means. And it is precisely these semiotic forms that make the difference to the more reporting messages, which are far less interactively embedded, but most importantly, do not contain any of these semiotic markers. Even if the structure of the beard pearl story remains somewhat fractured according to the narrative grammar of Labov, the narrative quality of the short sequence seems evident to me. In order to approach this more fragmented narrative practice, it is worth drawing on two further tracks of linguistic narrative research. First, it can be stated that Kara's narratives in smartphone-based messenger applications are narratives in interaction, as they have long been described in conversational analysis on the basis of her everyday spoken interactions. Kara and Katrin are both involved in the sequentially organized activity of performatively shaping and evaluating Kara's experience with the bearded pearl man on the street, and thus anchoring it as an everyday narrative in the stream of their shared interaction history. In addition, they are continuing a topic that was already relevant between them, and thus also refer to a common ground that serves their relationship work. However, what is also characteristic on conversation analytical work on everyday narratives, they are typically approaching narratives as so-called big packages that are larger communicative projects that require a narrator to secure the interactional flow for a longer period of time, so that the turn-taking system is more or less suspended for the duration of the storytelling. This perspective does not really apply to Kara's example. On the one hand, the narrative moments in Kara's messenger interactions do not correspond to the extensiveness of a big package. On the other hand, it is questionable anyway to what extent the interactional organization of everyday narratives in face-to-face communication can be compared with that in text-based messenger communication, as there are completely different participation frameworks in each case. Since in messenger interactions, there's no need to fight for the interactional flaw in the same way, as for example, Matthias Meiler already pointed out. If you want to tell a story, you can just type and send it as a message, even as a long one, without first having to obtain an assurance that the audience is ready to receive it. What seems to capture the character of many narrative moments in Kara's data better, however, is the concept of small stories, developed in interdisciplinary research and identity work between discourse psychology, linguistic anthropology, and sociolinguistics. The approach is also interactional and reconstructive in nature, but rejects the definitional necessity of the linear unfolding of narrated events as a big package. Instead, small story approaches identify narrative potentials, we could say, that those involved signal to each other and then can be taken up, developed further, but can also be dropped again by those involved. Giacorpoulou summarizes that a small story can be understood as the communication of non- or multilinear unfolding events and sequences in further narrative making, often realized as the telling of mundane. A small story analysis asks which spaces, times, characters, and events are invoked in an interaction, and with which means and function this world making takes place. Small stories are close to small talk in that their subject matter usually arises from the immediate context of interaction. Small stories are observations that occur in the immediate spatiotemporal context, or are at least associated with the immediate context of an interaction in such a way that their narration is possible without many words. I think we can already appreciate the extent to which this concept already describes what is happening around Kara's narration of the bearded man with his pearls. Furthermore, the small story concept has already proven itself as a heuristic tool, particularly in the context of digital communication. For example, Ruth Page, who examines narratives on social media platforms, and following on from this, also Katharina König, who also investigated narratives in messenger interaction, refer to small story research. But they also include the model of ox and caps that outlines 5 dimensions of narrative practice, which can be more or less apparent in small stories: tellability, tellership, embeddedness, linearity, and moral stance. In the grid of these dimensions, narrative actions can be dynamically traced in their structure and with regard to their communicative and social functions. Furthermore, Katharina König adds the 3 dimensions of publicness, multimodality, and sequencing with the view to applying the model to narratives in digital media. Okay, the reason why I mention all of these dimensions is that the question of how temporality, on the one hand, structures storytelling in smartphone-based interaction, and on the other hand, is deployed as a resource for performing narratives, lies across these dimensions outlined by Ox and Caps and König. For example, in mobile messaging, tellability is often created by telling what has just been or what is even now. For small stories, a particular topicality can therefore be indicated based on the portability of the medium. This narration, as the events are unfolding, can go hand in hand with a particular distribution of the tellership among the participants, as each responsive message has the potential to change not only the story, but also the underlying simultaneous offline events. The temporal synchronization of the narrative in the now of the participants goes hand in hand with a strong embeddedness in present offline contexts. This differs from public small stories that are posted in the form of memes on social networks, for example, and are designed to be disseminated and recontextualized. Instead, the understandings and specific meanings of small stories in private messenger interactions often result from the contextual knowledge shared by the well-known participants. A precondition for such storytelling is therefore also a limited publicness. The fact that a sometimes vague description of an event can be reconstructed by the participants as a narrative event in a story characterized by linearity presupposes epistemic common ground. Thus, small stories often provide only one narrative event, one narrative point, we could say, in order to be able to understand this point as part of the temporal and causal progression. A second narrative point is required. In private messenger interactions, such a second point usually lies in the interdiscursive past, we could say, in the interactional history of the participants. In this sense, small story fragments indicate narrative potentials, which the participants can then shape into stories as long as they have the required knowledge for that. Also, the moral stances that participants adopt by evaluating the narrated events are based on shared knowledge. What a narrated event means to the participants and how they morally evaluate it results from its embedding in previously established convictions. In the case of Kara, for example, the observation of the bearded pearl man is part of an interdiscursive storyline. The fact that Katherine's brother uses beard pearls was already a topic of discussion between Kara and Katherine before, and thus is a part of the interdiscursive chain of communicative events that constitutes their friendship. Here, the smartphone makes it possible to feed any everyday observation directly into the ongoing theme, and thus also to continue elaborating on the friendship between the two. The affordance of messenger applications to provide the interactional history as a continuous stream of messages, which makes it possible to scroll back into the past at any time, also helps this joint project. In Kara's example, the street encounter is a welcome prompt to update the recurring theme of the beard pearls. The narrative value of the event thus arises not only from its temporal topicality, but also on an interdiscursive level. What was already tellable in the past can now be told again. Furthermore, tellability value is brought to the event by using particular semiotic means. In doing so, the participants draw on the multimodality of the inventory of signs that is prefigured by their media, and that includes, in addition to linguistic, punctuational, and pictorial means, also the temporal resources. For example, the rhythm in which a narration is linearly developed in several text messages can be used to perform the temporal progression of the narrated events and its real-time character. The narrative practice of keeping interlocutors up to date in real time is not present in the beard pearls example, although here too the temporal topicality is emphasized by Kara in order to legitimize the narrative at the beginning. She wrote something like, "I just returned from the campus in the beginning." However, the use of temporal resources becomes particularly clear when smartphone-based storytelling is apparently happening simultaneously with the narrated events. The specific sequencing of a narration in several messages can then result, on the one hand, from the course of the events in the experienced offline context, which is successively observed and verbalized. On the other hand, narrators, of course, are also free to use sequencing to create the mere impression of a narrative in real time, and thus discourse strategically increase the tellability of their story. Temporality is then not just a physical matter of facts to which the participants are at the mercy of, but a communicatively produced construct that is part of a specific narrative practice. In order to break down these temporal relationships a little bit more, it is worth taking a look at the concepts of time in literary studies. According to Genette, every narration is fundamentally accompanied by a duality of time. That is, the duality of narrated time and narrative time. Narrative time, that is the time a narrator needs to tell her story, is open to manipulation to the narrator, as events can be condensed or stretched out over time. So an entire life in a novel might be then summarized on just half of a book page, for example, while only a few moments may be stretched out and described in the greatest possible detail and complexity over many, many book pages. The temporal effects of stretching and compressing always emerge from the relation of the narrated time to the narrative times. If the narrative time is shorter than the narrated time, there is a compressing effect. If the narrative time exceeds the narrated time, then there is the stretching effect. Depending on the medium in which the story is told, a distinction must also be made between the duration of the narrative and the duration of the reception of the narrative. The narrative time in novels, for example, is typically converted into the spatiality of book pages. The reading process of these pages can then take very different lengths of time depending on the reader. And furthermore, in addition to narrated time and narrative time, a narrative point of view in time can be analyzed for each narration. That is the temporal position of the narrator's voice, or the time of the narrative act. The narration of past events is prototypical here. What is being narrated usually precedes the time of narration. However, the narrative practice of telling the ongoing by means of small stories and smartphone-based interaction now gives narrators the opportunity to perform an alignment of the duality of time through message sequencing. Narrated time and narrative time then appear to be approximately congruent by sequencing the narrated events into several messages, each of which is sent with a minimal time offset to the narrated offline experience. At least, this is the impression that the narrator stages to a certain extent. If, in addition, all co-participants are simultaneously at their devices and accordingly can intervene in the sequencing of the narration, then there's also an alignment of production and reception time. Although these are never fully synchronized due to the technical constraints of the medium, the simultaneous orientation of all participants towards the successively unfolding screen record ensures a temporally shared narrative situation. And finally, the time of the narrative act is also specific to the practice of telling the ongoing, because the told story is not about what was, nor is it about what will be, but about events that are right now. Accordingly, this temporal constellation can also be described as present tense narration. However, we must always bear in mind that this temporal constellation is performed using semiotic means. In other words, it may very well differ from how the narrator experienced the actual time of a factual event. Okay, to come to an end of this lecture, I would like to explain how this is done by presenting a second case study. The example is taken from a data set of WhatsApp chats from young people in northern Germany. So it's not part of the new texting and time data set, but goes back to an earlier project on the literacy practices of adolescents. The messenger interactions of this data set take place between friends who usually know each other from school pretty well. Similar to Kara's data, moments of keeping each other up to date also permeate the everyday digital communication of these younger participants. This is also primarily done in the shape of status reports, which in many cases are actively requested by the interlocutors through messages that merely contain the initialism WYD for what are you doing? So in the German original, it's WMDS for was machst du so? The fact that the practice of status reporting is crystallized in abbreviations shows how central the activity is for the social population under investigation. While many responses to what are you doing turn out to be rather short and uninformative, for example, by containing only single words, such as chillin or nothing, the synchronized focus on the current experience of one or more participants always has the potential to expand the status report into a storytelling of the ongoing. An example of this can be seen in the WhatsApp chat between Otto and Anne, who are both 14 years old. Anne informs Otto in present tense that she has a problem. There is a spider in her room and she doesn't know how to remove it right now. I'm reading it to you. Anne says, I have a tiny little problem. No, I don't know what to do. I'm not afraid of those critters, but there's a huge spider stuck on my wall. I'm not afraid of them, but okay, I have a little respect. So I don't know how to make it go away right now. It's so disgusting. What do I do now? Get the broom and hit the monster. No, then it falls on my bed and then I still don't want to touch it when it's dead. Okay, wait a minute. I'll be right back. I just go to my brother. Get a hand brush. Yes, but it doesn't matter. My mom is now doing it. My brother is already sleeping. Oh, okay. The spider is eliminated. Almost. Many dots. Okay, the spider is removed. Now we can continue texting. Okay. Now we can continue texting. In message 1, Anne provides a starting situation, an orientation, we could say. She's engaging in a world making and positioning herself as an anxious person in this scenario. Because the message is written in the first person and in the present tense, the separation between the narrated Anne and the narrating Anne is removed. Accordingly, the anxious attitude that Anne indicates for herself in the narrated scenario by using graphic means, for example, through letter reduplication, such as in huge, so, or okay, and finally also through the intensive use of ellipsis dots, also applies to the Anne who's interacting with Otto at the same time. This interlocking of the narrated scenario with the narrative situation is also evident in Otto's involvement in the events. By establishing the scenario as simultaneous to the interaction, not only is the evaluation of the narrated events open to collaboration, but Otto himself can also intervene in the narrated situation through instructions and comments, and thus, to a certain extent, interact with the narrated world himself. In this way, his command in message 2, get the broom and hit the monster, is reminiscent of early text-based computer games in which the progress of an adventure story could be decided by typing in a command. Otto now seems to intervene in Anne's story in a similar way. Otto thus also becomes a character in the narrated world and has the opportunity to indicate his social position within the narrative, which in turn also applies to the social positioning within the narrative situation. So there's a social positioning going on different levels within the story, but also between the participants in the interactional situation. Otto contrasts Anne's fearful stance with that of a fearless doer who grabs a weapon and fights the spider. In this way, both participants also functionalize the narrative as a means of gender display, of course. The initial situation of the spider, construed as problematic, dramatic, and therefore tellable, is then developed further over several messages and allows Otto, apparently in real time, to participate in the treatment of the animal in Anne's room for around 8 minutes, with minute-by-minute updates carrying the narrative sequence over a total of 12 messages. Both participants consistently use verbal forms in the present tense, as well as temporal expressions to align the narrated time and the narrative time. Finally, with regard to the temporal progression of the narrative, Anne's message 10, in which the problem of the spider is solved, is particularly interesting. In this message, the performance of simultaneity is clearly evident, as there's a narrative linearity within the message of posting that can only be produced in this way if the narrative time is after the narrated event, after the narrated time. At the beginning of the message, it says, the spider's eliminated, ... almost. Anne constructs a dramatic climax through the syntactic exclusion of the temporal adverb in the right margin of the sentence and its spatial linear demarcation through ellipsis dots. The central problem of the story is about to be resolved. In this way, Anne indicates the relevance of temporality here. However, instead of dropping off again and conveying the next narrative event in a temporally shifted message, and thus maintaining the alignment of narrated time and narrative time through sequencing, Anne instead produces 982 points. In a sense, an excessively iterated form of ellipsis dots. These dots now seem to represent the temporal duration in which Anne's mother murders the spider. Temporality is coded here as spatiality and must be decoded accordingly in the reading process. After that, Anne then starts again with an OK after the dots. The preceding action is marked as completed by the discourse marker. The spider has finally been eliminated without any temporal adverbial restrictions anymore. After further segmentation using ellipsis dots, there's finally a rudimentary coda with a renewed temporal adverbial update in which the narrative world is closed and the focus metacommunicatively returns to the chat activity. Now we can continue texting. So the construction of temporality, which runs through message 10 in the form of temporal adverbs and ellipsis dots, is interesting in that the sent message is not displayed on Otto's smartphone screen bit by bit, but in one fell swoop. The description of the spider's condition as almost eliminated and eliminated appears simultaneously on Otto's smartphone screen, and it is only the reading process that seals the animal's fate in the narrated world. Although a practice of simultaneous telling the ongoing is initially indicated, Anne constructs temporal progression here. Uses it discourse strategically, and thus ultimately also uses it as a central resource for creating narrative tellability. Okay, let me wrap up things briefly. Text message sequences, such as those about Kara's encounter with the bearded pearlman or Anna's spider problem, show that the most mundane moments can not only be reported at any time to network friends because of the portability of the device, but that such reports always also provide source material that can be expanded into narratives using various semiotic means. The particular specificity of this narrative practice in smartphone-based interactions therefore lies in the temporalities that result from the affordances of mobile media. This gives users the opportunity throughout the day to deploy small story potentials of what they have experienced offline to tie in with topics and knowledge that are already established in the socially shared communicative history of interactional partners. Text messages construe a narrated world that sometimes seem to lack a narrative progression, but nevertheless lines in with the linearity of a shared interdiscursivity as a small story fragment. Furthermore, the collaborative sequencing of a story is also affected by the temporal affordances of the smartphone. The portability of the medium opens up the possibility of performing and rhetorically utilizing an alignment of narrated time and narrative time. Offline events and narration are then staged as simultaneous activities so that the narrated situation and the narrative situation become permeable. This sometimes leads to a stronger interactional involvement of the audience. For example, when listeners are giving recommendations for the next step and actions of the narrator in the narrated world. The entanglement of narrated time and narrative time, therefore, ultimately also affects the social positioning associated with narratives. The social and moral stances that characters adopt in the narrated world reflect even more directly on the social constellation of the interaction in which the narrative takes place. So in conclusion, can be stated that the narration of ongoing events using smartphones appears to be both an innovative and central practice of mediatized and mobilized societies, which should be addressed by sociocultural oriented narrative research. I hope this lecture has at least made a start in this regard, not only highlighting the specific temporality conditions of storytelling that result from the use of mobile media, but also arguing that temporality in smartphone-based interactions is not just there, but is communicatively produced and functionalized. Temporality is a communicative resource that participants can use strategically in discourse. The task of future research can be to build on this and to demonstrate the diverse social functions and temporal narrative practices that are fulfilled in everyday digital communication. The question of what it means for narrators and recipients, both communicatively and socially, when what is told is simultaneous, has only begun to be answered so far. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Florian, for this rich and intriguing presentation. I'm blending in the standard view in order to see some more of the audience, if I can. Thank you for this. We have some time. We have about 12 minutes of discussion time. You can either give a signal with your yellow hand or with your physical hand to ask for the floor, or you can write it into the chat and we'll take your message from there. Let's see what happens. Maybe I can start just breaking the ice with a double question. One question out of in order to put the analysis of the examples into a more general context. would you be able to say what the, let's say, the numerical importance of small stories in your data you've collected so far is? So is it the case that one particular or one individual informant produces these small stories all the time or a couple of times a day, or so are they frequently distributed in the material or more rarely? And the other question is, what is the role of other modalities other than written language? So let's say spoken language messages, voice messages, or memes, or animated GIFs and things like that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. I think when it comes to the first question, it's hard to tell right now because we just started collecting the data, and we still need to do some coding on the material. So I have to admit it will be like a little bit anecdotal when I tell you about that. But in my observation so far, I think it turns out that people need some time to do these sort of small stories, even when they're small. So they need like a little bit like longer device attention clusters. So for example, when they're sitting in the train on their ride home after work, then they have time to do these sorts of storytelling. Reports are more typical when the device attention clusters are just about maybe 2 minutes or something, while the storytelling takes place when they are at their device for longer periods of time. Yeah, but as I said, we definitely have to do some coding to analyze it more in terms of frequency. And concerning your second question, it's also really good because I think it comes together with the first observation that people need time to tell their stories, even when they're small. We could also observe, at least I think that right now, and when it comes to these 4 first data sets, that people tend to use voice messages to realize these type of small stories. But again, then they need this like calm space, this this little bit extra time to focus on their device and to record a voice message. But yeah, that's pretty common, I guess.
Thank you. Cool. Let's take a question from Alexandra Georgakopoulou. There you go.
Oops. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Hi. Very interesting and very rich. Thank you so much. One thing I would not necessarily question, but just perhaps add some of my own experience of working with, kind of breaking news and ongoing storytelling on the go. I've tried various terms over the years. It's that I would query a little bit this idea that we are talking about new temporal structures. And I'm saying this because for my sins, I particularly followed over a number of years breaking news, for instance, starting from, believe it or not, there's lots of confluences of living and telling, happenings and sharing that happened, for instance, in my data 20 years ago amongst people, just friends who knew one another really well and were having coffee. No media there. Then I kind of tracked this when mobile phones were coming up and teenagers were using them. So breaking news were being reconfigured a little bit there. Then I tracked breaking news on different social media platforms. And of course, exactly like you're finding, I saw that this bringing together of happenings, I wouldn't necessarily call them events either. I think there's a lot of structuralist terminology, that comes when we say narration, narrative. There's a lot of structural terminology that doesn't quite capture the fleetingness of those phenomena. But I did find, of course, that the participant roles and relations, the placement of those phenomena in different platforms, different spaces of the platforms, all of these things very much shaped the functions of telling, living and telling, as it were. One thing that I have found useful to do is to talk about, to somehow abstract from specific types of small stories that are about the here and now, and look at the broader practice, which I have called sharing life in the moment. And on social media platforms particularly, this practice is very intimately linked with affordances and the algorithmic logic of timeliness of posts, of the attention economy. You share snackable little things rather than big things because you think about your audience and their attention, and also about normativities around the idea of we are kind of 24/7 available for communication. So I wonder about the extent to which this practice with the mediatization, temporality rhythms and normativities are transferable to your data as well.
Mm-hmm. I wonder that too.
Way, accounting, giving us the broader interpretive framework for the practice as opposed to, X and Y temporal structures, which were there always, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for your rich comment. I mean, especially I didn't really think about the news, the breaking news. And that's a really nice parallel. Mm-hmm.
Good, thank you.
Thank you for this. There's a question by Heike.
I have a question on the ongoing project. So how will you work with the data? So the data is collected in real life, and then you analyze it in a quite complex way. And how will you further deal with the data? Will you also present the visualizations that you showed us and other things to to people to react on them or to annotate? Or so how will you work with data?
Yeah, right now a big deal with the data is to anonymize it and to pseudonymize it. So this takes an unbelievable amount of time right now. And after that, we're going to start transcribing it with the help of Elan. So there will be an transcription of the writing process, for example, of the keyboard, but also a transcription of what you see on the screens, what apps are used at the specific moments or periods of time.
Transcription means that afterwards it's searchable, that you can search on all different levels and media that are involved. Okay, that's great.
Exactly. It's exported to an XML file, and this XML file would be like the fundament of an online database we're gonna hopefully to publish in 4 years. And it might look totally different in 4 years, but the idea right now is to have this sort of visualization that I already showed to you, and to make them interactive so that the user will be able to click on one of these dots and then to scroll into, to zoom into the videos and have also the transcription underneath the video. But I mean, it's like a future science fiction stuff right now. Because right now we're collecting the data and we anonymize it, and it's a super slow process, to be honest. And then but that's the idea so far.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We could take one more quick question. Genette?
Hi, I have a quick question. I thought this point about the WID initialisms was really interesting. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about acronyms like that specifically. Do you think it's more about asking for status updates, so like encouraging the other person to tell a story, or do you think it's really more of a, do you have time to chat?
I think it's inherently fatigue, because they are not really interested what's going on. I mean, if I find it like super fast, I could show it, because I showed one of these interactions in another presentation. One moment. Here it is. Okay, here it is. Nice. I have to share my screen again. So you can see that. Okay, it's still in German, but you see hi. WG means how are you? Good. How are you? Also good. Cool. Good morning. Good morning. Now, how are you? Good. How are you? What are you doing right now? Chilling. And you? Same. Hi. And so on and so forth. So there are like super long sequences just consisting out of these acronyms. And so the short answer would be no. I think it's inherently just a fatigue ritual, but still there's always the potential of expand it and to take the question serious and to give a story.
Could you also say really quickly how old approximately the people who do these like launch?
They are teenagers. Yeah,
okay.
They're teenagers. And it's super unregistered with being a teenager, because when I show it in my lectures, for example, everyone is like a little bit embarrassed because they remember that they did like 4 years ago or something. So yeah, I think, yeah, it seems to be part of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.